I reached out and turned down the volume on the radio, playing the weather forecast on the wooden counter. The last 18-wheeler had just started its engine and pulled away from the concrete yard, leaving the complete silence of the rest stop at 2 in the morning. A figure appeared, standing motionless outside the large glass door, wearing a tattered coat amidst the heavy snow and sleet of Montana. Their eyes were wide open, staring straight at me without blinking. The convenience store stood isolated beside the interstate median, surrounded by dark pine trees in the shadows of the valley. At 20, working the night shift from 10 o'clock at night to 6 o'clock in the morning was my only way of earning enough money for tuition and rent for the next semester. Inside the counter, fluorescent lights cast a pale, warm light thanks to the underfloor heating running at full power. The air was thick with the smell of brewed coffee and grease from the automatic sausage grill. I always thought this place was safe, because every blind spot was monitored by the old-fashioned, protruding security cameras mounted on the ceiling. But that reassurance vanished when I looked up at the display screen next to the cash register. The third camera facing the parking lot in front had been bent downwards, revealing only a patch of frosted concrete. I bent down to find the key fob that was always attached to the drawer to adjust the camera, but the hook was empty. The key fob, controlling all the functional room doors, including the emergency exit at the back, was gone. If I hadn't deliberately worked an extra shift that night to earn my attendance bonus, I probably would have noticed the signs of trouble sooner. My head felt heavy, all my energy drained after 2 stressful exams at school during the day, leading me to believe that I had accidentally dropped the key fob in the trash can while cleaning. The woman in the tattered coat outside the window had long since disappeared. I hurried to the small window overlooking the narrow passageway separating the side of the building from the empty lot behind it. Under the yellowish security lights, a thin figure was limping, pressed against the cold corrugated iron wall, heading straight towards the warehouse's receiving door. My weary brain immediately conjured up a plausible explanation, that it was just a homeless person who had wandered in from the highway seeking refuge from the sub-zero temperatures of the approaching snowstorm. I walked down the hallway, checking the thick steel doorknob and finding the lock still firmly engaged. I returned to the counter, stapled the stack of receiving invoices, and tried to focus on the numbers to dispel the unsettling feeling in my heart. A dry, sharp click came from the row of refrigerated display cases for soft drinks at the end of the store. I looked up. The glass door of cabinet number 4 was wide open at a 90-degree angle, the cold air inside pouring out and forming a thin layer of mist close to the floor. Under the fluorescent light, dark streaks of melted snow from someone's shoe soles were clearly visible on the white tile floor, stretching from the walkway leading to the industrial storage room behind the counter. That person had sneaked into the building before I could lock the back door. The surroundings were completely isolated. Not a single car had passed on the highway for the past hour. I reached under the wooden counter, my fingers gripping the iron bar used for scraping truck tires, keeping my breathing steady so as not to make any noise. The ceiling lights suddenly flickered 3 times in quick succession before going out, followed by the heater fan ceasing its operation, plunging the entire shop into a frozen silence. The space was now illuminated only by the dim red glow of the neon sign outside, reflected through the large glass front. From the shadows of the passageway leading to the warehouse, the sound of dragging footsteps began to echo, slow and steady. The sound stopped just behind the thin plaster partition, less than 2 meters from where I stood. The warehouse door slowly creaked open. A woman emerged, her shadow stretching long across the tiled floor in the dim red neon light of the sign. She wore a tattered coat stained with frost, but her head was tilted unnaturally to one side. Her eyes were wide open, and she stood motionless 3 feet away, not making any move to attack, but instead displaying a stiff, vacant smile, staring intently into the empty space right next to my ear. That eerie silence was broken when she suddenly reached into her coat pocket, pulled out a gleaming metal boning knife, and lunged straight at my chest. My instinctive reaction made me recoil sharply, my heel hitting the edge of a wooden cabinet, but I still managed to swing the iron scraper I was using to scrape tires with all my might. The iron struck her wrist with a dry thump. The knife flew off onto the tiled floor, sliding into the shadows beneath the shelving unit. Without a cry or a futile plea for help, I turned, using all my body weight to lunge toward the front door, pushing the steel emergency exit latch. The glass door swung open, and a blast of icy wind hit my face as I dashed out onto the concrete pavement. The moment my feet touched the thick snow in the parking lot, two powerful headlights from the highway suddenly swept across, illuminating the center of the rest stop. It was a Ford Explorer patrol car from the state police, on its routine night patrol. The officer immediately slammed on the brakes, sounded the siren, and jumped out of the car with his handgun in hand when he saw me fleeing in panic with the woman chasing closely behind. She was subdued, pinned to the frost-covered concrete pavement, and handcuffed on the spot in less than 2 minutes. The subsequent questioning and investigation by authorities uncovered a horrifying truth. When searching the woman's tattered backpack, police found a small leather-bound notebook. Inside there were no names, but it was full of minute-by-minute records of my movements, shift changes, and daily routines at the gas station for the past 3 months. She even used the stolen master key from the previous afternoon to sneak into the industrial freezer in the storage room hours before my shift began, patiently waiting in the cold for the exact moment I was alone. When you walk into a deserted convenience store or gas station at night, look closely at the blind spots out of the security cameras, because someone may have calculated the exact moment you were alone long before. My name is Martha. I'm a retired librarian. My husband Thomas and I have lived in our 2-story house in the suburbs of Austin, Texas, for over 20 years. Our children are all grown up and have long since moved out. Our life as an old couple is generally dull but peaceful. My biggest habit each day is sitting on the porch. I enjoy knitting, reading old newspapers, occasionally listening to crime radio programs, and enjoying the atmosphere with my husband. From my armchair, my view is straight across the street from the house. That house had been empty for months since the previous owner moved out. To be honest, looking at a house without lights or sounds for so long made me feel a little lonely. But everything changed completely one morning last year. A gleaming blue Porsche Taycan electric sports car pulled up and parked right in front of the empty house. Stepping out of the car was a young man, probably in his early 20s. He had a very bright appearance and was fashionably dressed in expensive designer clothes. His arrival quickly enlivened the neighborhood, which was usually full of elderly people. Just a few days after moving in, he proactively brought a small gift basket to my door and rang the doorbell to say hello. He introduced himself as Quinn. Quinn spoke very politely and intelligently. He said he was a programmer who had become rich quickly after selling a startup company in artificial intelligence technology to a large corporation. Currently, he works as a freelance consultant from home. Quinn quickly won my husband's favor. The two of them often stood by the fence every afternoon discussing the stock market or investments. Quinn looked extremely wealthy. The first thing he did after moving in was hire a team of workers to upgrade the entire residence into a smart ecosystem. He installed a facial recognition electronic lock, an automatic curtain system, and a dense network of AI-powered cameras around the house. He told Thomas that the technology made him feel completely safe. But at the time, neither Quinn nor I could have imagined that this very modern security system would be the very thing that plunged him into an ultimate nightmare. About a month later, I began to notice the first anomalies. Every few days, at fixed times, when Quinn had already driven out of the house for work, a sleek gray Tesla Model 3 would pull up. A young, slender woman with a stylish short haircut would get out. What caught my attention was that she never rang the doorbell or knocked. She would simply touch her finger to the electronic control panel on the smart door, and the smart lock would flash green and automatically unlock immediately. At first, I thought it was Quinn's girlfriend, and that he had shared access to the house with her. Since young people are so open about dating these days, I didn't think much of it. But the more I observed, the more I sensed something was seriously wrong. This girl never stayed overnight or enjoyed her time in the house. Every time she came, she always carried a rather heavy mechanic's backpack. She would go inside for about 30 minutes and then rush out. Her face was always shifty, full of anxiety, and she kept looking around. That furtive behavior was more like someone on a secret mission or a thief than a girl visiting her boyfriend's house. Things started to get tense one late afternoon. That day, Quinn came home earlier than usual, while her gray Tesla was still parked on the side of the road. Just minutes after Quinn went inside, a fierce argument broke out on the front porch. I was watering the plants in the yard when I heard Quinn shouting. His voice was trembling with anger. He yelled at her, telling her she was crazy and forbidding her from ever hanging around there again. In contrast to Quinn's rage, the girl didn't cry or show any fear. She just stood there, staring straight at Quinn with a chillingly cold gaze. She mumbled something threatening, then calmly got into her car and drove away. I thought it was just a quarrel between a couple whose relationship was falling apart, but things took a completely different turn. Despite the ban, the gray Tesla continued to appear in the following days. She no longer parked in front of Quinn's house, but instead pulled over to a secluded corner at the end of the street. From my porch, I could see her sitting silently in her car for hours on end, glued to a tablet. At the same time, I noticed the AI camera system outside Quinn's house, occasionally flashing red erratically, as if the sophisticated security system was being remotely interfered with by some unknown force. Then the fateful night arrived. It was a late, windless night, the entire neighborhood long asleep. I was still in the living room finishing a few pages of my book when I inadvertently glanced out the window. I froze instantly as I witnessed the entire smart lighting system and the cameras outside Quinn's house suddenly go out at once. Immediately afterward, the automatic curtains inside his house began to close, as if an invisible hand were isolating the house from the outside world. In the dim light, I was horrified to see a thin figure emerge from a gray Tesla parked in the distance, silently approaching Quinn's back door. Sensing something was wrong, I stammered Thomas's name, while tremblingly reaching for my phone to call Quinn. But before I could dial, Quinn's blood-curdling scream shattered the silence, followed by the crashing sound of shattering porcelain. I immediately urged Thomas to call 911. Less than 10 minutes later, sirens blared. 2 police cars and an ambulance sped towards the house. The police burst through the door. When they led the girl out in handcuffs, I shuddered. Her clothes were stained with fresh blood, but her face wore a satisfied smile, her eyes staring blankly into space. Quinn was then carried out on a stretcher by paramedics. He was pale, one hand clutching his blood-soaked shoulder from a deep stab wound, his mouth constantly uttering groans of pain. A week after that horrific incident, Quinn returned to his house. His arm was still heavily bandaged and immobilized with a sling. Seeing him trudging along alone, packing his belongings with a dejected look, my wife and I took the initiative to walk across the street to check on him. Quinn welcomed us into his house with a weary expression, and then bitterly recounted the whole truth that the police had just uncovered. The girl's name was Chloe, a black hat hacker and a fanatical stalker on social media. Quinn bitterly admitted that they had never been in love, and before the argument on the porch, he had never even met her in person. Chloe had been following Quinn from tech forums, knowing he was rich and talented. She used sophisticated network hacking techniques, copying malware to infiltrate the smart home system that Quinn was so proud of. Her sneaking into the house while Quinn was away wasn't for dates, but to install spyware on the server, and to secretly hide miniature cameras disguised as light bulbs and electrical outlets. She monitored Quinn's every move, even installing a GPS tracker under his car to track his daily activities. On the night of the incident, Chloe, knowing Quinn was about to sign a contract to transfer to another state, activated remote administrative privileges, turned off all security cameras, cut off the power to the house, and broke in through the back door with a knife. She entered the bedroom, held a knife to Quinn's neck, and with the insane intention of making him disappear with her forever. Quinn fought back fiercely and miraculously survived, but the stab wound narrowly missed his carotid artery. Quinn didn't stay in that house any longer. As soon as his wounds healed, he hastily sold off all the property and his expensive tech gadgets for a bargain price to move elsewhere. Before getting into his car and leaving the neighborhood, he looked at me, gave a bitter smile, and said that he had learned a very expensive lesson from his naivety. His constant sharing of his luxurious lifestyle, showing off his technological achievements and smart home system on online forums, had inadvertently made him an easy target for real-life perverts. He feared that Chloe still had programmer friends who shared her crazy hobby, and he never dared feel safe staying there for another second. The house across the street once again fell into a state of emptiness and darkness, just like the day before Quinn arrived. But this time, Every time I looked across the desolate courtyard, I no longer felt the same loneliness as before, but instead a vague, chilling fear ran down my spine. Now, every time I sit on the porch knitting, just hearing the electronic doorbell or a notification from my smartphone makes me jump. The digital age has brought convenience, but it has also made people's privacy and safety more fragile than ever. You'll never know if, behind those subtly flickering smart LED lights in the corner of the room, there are invisible eyes silently watching your every breath in the darkness. I moved to Savannah, Georgia, simply to escape. A tumultuous divorce and financial ruin in my old city forced me to disappear immediately. I work as a restorer of 19th century oil paintings. The job requires solitude, and the secluded, walled old town was the perfect hiding place. But something unexpected happened. The house next door was a huge gray Gothic mansion like a private museum. It was built so close, completely blocking out the little afternoon sunlight and casting my office into a gloomy cold darkness all day long. I spent my days knocking on doors, greeting neighbors in the neighborhood. At the end of the day, when my social energy was completely depleted, I finally stopped in front of the gray mansion next door. I rang the doorbell. The heavy oak door swung open, and the person who appeared surprised me slightly. In stark contrast to the old, gloomy appearance of the house stood a rather young, handsome man. He wore a perfectly tailored three-piece suit, looking as elegant as if he were about to enter a high society ball. He smiled politely and said in a warm, deep voice, "Hello, I'm Marcus. How can I help you?" I extended my hand, trying to force a friendly smile. "Hello, I'm Arthur. I just moved into the house next door. I'm just walking around today to say hello to everyone in the neighborhood." When Marcus learned that I was a specialist in restoring 19th century oil paintings, his eyes lit up in a strange way. He stopped me at the doorstep, excitedly saying, "Restoring paintings? That's wonderful. Preserving and repositioning the original layers of color from that period is truly a supreme art, especially the way you handled the natural cracks without losing the soul of the antique canvas. I truly admire people with hands like yours." He introduced himself as an auctioneer and high-end art broker for private collections. Marcus's demeanor was extremely confident and captivating, the kind of person who always takes control of the conversation. But that enthusiasm vanished the moment I asked a casual question. "This mansion is as large as a miniature museum. Do you manage it all by yourself? I don't see any servants or anyone else around." The smile on Marcus's lips froze instantly. His eyes turned cold, fixed on me in a suffocating silence, so profound I could hear the wind whistling through the oak trees. He evaded the question, his voice suddenly dropping several tones. "My work always demands absolute solitude and quiet. I prefer to do things myself." Then he quickly pulled out a black, gold-embossed business card from his vest pocket. "Nice to meet you, Arthur. Have a good evening." The heavy oak door slammed shut in front of me, so quickly and decisively that it sent a blast of cold air straight into my face. That action left me with a feeling of disappointment and a strange unease about this handsome but mysterious neighbor. For the next 4 months after that brief and cold encounter, Marcus lived like a ghost. I worked from home, and my art restoration studio was in the attic on the 3rd floor, overlooking the entire estate behind Marcus's house. From my desk, I could observe his enormous mansion with just a glance, but I never saw a single customer, no delivery person, and no maid. His luxury car always sat silently in the garage, never moving. Every time I texted him to invite him for coffee, Marcus politely declined via text message, citing a long business trip to Europe. But there was something very illogical about it. From my attic window at midnight, I occasionally saw the thick, dark velvet curtains behind the large stained glass windows of his house subtly shifting. Someone was inside that museum-like mansion, moving in the absolute darkness and avoiding the light of day. Then, an incident occurred one Thursday night. At exactly 1:45 a.m., I was awakened by a strange series of sounds. I have a habit of leaving my window slightly ajar while I sleep to let in the night breeze. It wasn't the loud music of a modern party, but the haunting, mournful melodies of the opera Dido and Aeneas emanating from Marcus's garden speakers. The volume wasn't too loud, but the deep, resonant cello notes continuously echoed against the walls, gently vibrating the glass panes of my bedroom window. I jumped up, walked to the window, and looked out. I was completely stunned. Parked in a neat row in Marcus's yard were about 5 classic luxury cars, ranging from vintage Rolls-Royces to gleaming Bentleys. Amidst the opera music, I could clearly hear the boisterous sounds of a high society party. Boisterous laughter, the clinking of glasses, and thunderous applause. Clearly, he was throwing a huge party in the middle of the week. Since I had an important restored painting to deliver to a client the next day and needed to sleep, I quickly threw on a dark coat and headed to Marcus's house. The opera music grew louder and louder, echoing through the towering brick walls. I stepped onto the porch, rang the doorbell repeatedly, but there was no answer. I banged on the heavy oak door, still no response. In frustration, I grabbed the brass doorknob, half expecting it to be locked, but to my surprise, the heavy oak door creaked open with a gentle push. It wasn't locked at all. I pushed gently, and the oak door opened wide enough for me to step inside. The large hall was completely dark, with only the light from the living room illuminating the interior. In the corner was a neatly arranged pile of expensive leather shoes and high heels, at least a dozen pairs, but the house was eerily silent. Laughter and clinking of glasses continued steadily, but there was no sign of human presence. I ventured into the living room, then the kitchen. Not a soul in sight. Not a single half-empty glass of wine. Not a single scrap of leftover food. It was then that I froze, realizing the sound was coming from the high-end speaker system in the 4 corners of the room. It was a pre-recorded tape. Laughter, applause, whispers, all repeated in a perfect cycle. A fake party. But the pile of shoes at the door and the luxury cars in the yard were real. Someone was definitely in this house. Just then, I heard another sound, something not coming from the speakers. It was the steady rumble of heavy machinery, mixed with the clanging of metal, emanating from the deep corner of the hallway, where the staircase led down to the ancient wine cellar beneath the mansion. I ventured down. The cellar staircase was dark and reeked of dampness and mold. Descending to the bottom step, I saw a brilliant beam of halogen light emanating from the slightly ajar door of the underground room. I held my breath and peered inside. 3 elderly men, wearing specialized gas masks and waterproof protective clothing, stood around a large industrial grinder. On a nearby stainless steel table were old wooden boxes. One man reached into a box and pulled out gray, dry human bone fragments. I could clearly see parts of a skull and broken leg bones. He dropped them into the machine's chute. The machine roared furiously, grinding the bones into a fine grayish-white powder. The second man poured the powder into a large container, mixing it with thick, crude oil paint and a chemical solvent. The pungent smell of ammonia and chlorine bleach assaulted my nostrils, almost making me vomit. My mind reeled. With my knowledge as a restoration expert, I immediately understood everything. Art appraisers always use carbon dating to verify the age of ancient paintings. To perfectly forge a 19th century work, bypassing even the most rigorous scanning machines, forgers must use oil paints mixed with the ashes or bones of people who died that era, or even from the graves of deceased artists themselves. Marcus and his accomplices were essentially a high-end forgery ring that operated by excavating and desecrating the bodies of the dead. In a fit of extreme panic, my legs trembled. I took a step back, but the darkness of the cellar disoriented me. The side of my coat brushed against an empty wooden picture frame against the wall. It fell to the cement floor with a dry, resounding clatter. The grinding machine abruptly stopped. The halogen lights inside the underground room went out. A deathly silence fell. I knew I'd been discovered. Without thinking, I turned and ran frantically up the stairs. I dashed through the main hall, flung open the oak door, and leaped out into the yard. I didn't dare run back to my front door. I jumped over the low brick fence separating the 2 houses, rushed into the backyard, and slipped through a side door, locking it securely. I ran straight to the attic, switched off all the lights, knelt under the window awning, and peered inside. A few minutes later, the mansion's doors swung open. The 3 men in gas masks who had rushed out earlier were frantically sweeping their powerful flashlights through the bushes, corners of the yard, and surrounding alleys. I heard them arguing fiercely in the street below. "Damn it, someone got in. I told you to lock the front door." I was busy operating the machine earlier, I forgot. Who was in here? They even started shoving each other, almost coming to blows in the middle of the street. But after searching for no one, they turned off the opera radio, retreated inside, and locked the door tightly. I lay motionless on the attic floor until dawn. When the first rays of sunlight managed to penetrate the brick wall and shine into the room, I dragged myself to the window and looked out. All the gleaming luxury cars had vanished without a trace. Even Marcus's car, usually parked in the garage, was gone. The enormous mansion stood silently, its doors slammed shut, as cold and desolate as a recently dug-up mass grave. My mind reeled with bewilderment. To reassure myself I wasn't going insane, I pretended to take a walk and stopped at 3 houses at the end of the street to inquire about the party the night before. But they all shook their heads, giving me strange looks. They said the walls were thick, the distances were far, and they hadn't heard any opera or commotion the night before. I realized I was completely alone in this horrifying reality. Weeks, then months passed. Marcus never returned. The Gothic house began to show signs of rapid decay. Weeds grew knee-high in the grounds, obscuring the cobblestone path. The mailbox by the gate was crammed full of advertisements and overdue bills, tattered by the rain and wind. Just outside my front door lay 2 wooden barrels of crude oil paint, delivered late, left exposed to the scorching Savannah sun until the wood cracked and leaked a thick, pungent, chemical-smelling liquid. I was in a state of extreme panic and paranoid delirium. I reinforced all the windows, installed security cameras in every nook and cranny, but the fear wasn't outside. It was right on my desk. Now, whenever I stand before those 19th century oil paintings needing restoration, I no longer see them through the eyes of an artist. I pick up my brush with trembling hands. Looking at the deep reds, earthy browns, or the mottled layers of paint on the canvases of these great masters, a chilling question runs down my spine. How much of the ashes of a tormented soul lies beneath those layers of paint? How many graves have been dug up to create the million-dollar masterpieces now displayed in opulent museums? I lived the following days in utter torment and anguish. I didn't know whether I should pick up the phone and call the police to expose this ruthless art crime ring, or remain silent to protect my own life from the invisible hunt of those lurking in the shadows. But one thing I knew for sure: the art world I once revered, from that fateful Thursday night, was forever stained with the color of ashes.